The transport ship smelled like ammonia and wet iron. Nalan Rai sat in the back row, bag wedged between his boots, and said nothing for 6 hours. The other passengers weren't passengers. They were cadets. Every single one of them could kill him before he got a sentence out, and they all knew that, and he knew they knew. Nobody sat near him. The ship hit Vorath hard. Everything on Vorath hit hard. The gravity grabbed him the moment the ramp opened, not painful, not yet, but insistent, like something pressing a thumb into both shoulders to remind him he was in the wrong place. The air was thick and tasted like metal shavings. The sky was the wrong shade of red. The academy rose from the cliff face ahead, dark stone and sharp angles, built into the rock like it had grown there rather than been assembled. A Vorathi handler in gray armor met them at the base of the ramp and pointed toward the main gate. No words. The cadets moved. Nalan moved with them. Registration hall the size of a hangar. Long tables, hard floors, overhead lights buzzing at a frequency that put a headache behind his eyes inside 2 minutes. Cadets queued by species. There was no queue for humans. There had never been a queue for humans. A clerk with 4 fingers and pale yellow eyes stared at Nalan for a long moment, then pointed at a side table with a single chair facing a terminal. The system scanned him. Height, weight, bone density, muscle fiber type, sensory range, pain threshold, reaction speed. The results went to a screen that Instructor Graddock read aloud at the orientation briefing an hour later. Graddock was 7 feet of gray-green muscle with bone ridges along both shoulders and a voice like gravel getting crushed under something heavier. He read Nalan's numbers last. The barracks went quiet for exactly 1 second. Then it didn't. The loudest laugh came from a Keth-born cadet named Brull. Thick neck, arms that looked put together from larger arms, the laugh of someone who had never been wrong about anything in his life. Not all the cadets around him laughed. Some just stared at Nalan the way predators stare at something they haven't decided to chase yet. Nalan sat in the 3rd row, looked at the wall behind Graddock's head, and didn't change his expression once. He found his bunk that evening in a bay with 12 cadets. It was sized for a Thyron mattress a foot too long, built for a different center of gravity. He didn't complain. He put the bag under the frame, sat on the edge, and spent the next 2 hours learning the room. 4 exits. One was behind a storage locker nobody had opened since his arrival. He noted which cadets slept facing the wall, which ones faced out. Figured out which bunk creaked, which light above the door stayed on all night, which way the ventilation pushed air. He noticed the cadet in the far corner, a small Thyron named Fenn, wasn't sleeping either, just lying still, watching the ceiling. Nalan didn't sleep until the 3rd hour of night. By then he had memorized every corridor between the barracks and the mess hall, the armory, the training yard, and the 2 high-ground positions he could reach within 90 seconds of leaving his bunk. Brull found him in the mess hall the next morning. Not subtle about it. Walked straight at him, wide enough to fill the corridor between tables, stopped close enough that Nalan could smell whatever Keth-born species had for breakfast. 2 other cadets drifted to positions behind Brull's shoulders without being asked. A routine they'd done before. Brull said something in Vorathi. The translator caught most of it. Short version, "You are in the wrong place, small thing." Nalan looked at the gap to Brull's left, about half a step wide. He picked up his tray, stepped into the gap at an angle, turned his shoulder to fit, and walked out the other side. No hurry. No pushing. He moved through it like he'd already measured it, which he had. Sat down at the nearest open table and kept eating. Brull stood there. His 2 companions looked at each other. Across the room, a Thyron cadet named Sierra had watched the whole thing. Long-limbed, precise, amber eyes that didn't miss much. She turned back to her food and said nothing, but she'd stopped chewing for a moment, and she didn't start again until Brull finally walked away. Graddock was passing through on his morning round. He didn't slow down, didn't look at Nalan directly, but he paused at the door long enough to glance back once, with the flat, unreadable look of someone filing something away. That night, Nalan mapped 2 more exit routes he'd missed the day before. He was starting to understand the shape of this place. Not the architecture was already memorized. He meant the shape of how things worked, who deferred to whom, where the yard had blind spots, which instructors walked which routes at which hours. He was the smallest thing in the academy, by almost every number on that printout. He'd been smaller before, in worse places. He went to sleep calculating angles. 3 days in, and Nolan had already built a reputation for being quiet in the wrong way. Not scared quiet, not careful quiet. The kind of quiet that made cadets feel like they were being studied. They were, though most of them couldn't have said exactly how they knew. The first field trial went up on the board outside the training hall on the fourth morning. Cadets assigned pairs. Nolan read the list twice to make sure the translation wasn't glitching. His partner was Fen. Fen was the smallest cadet in the building. Young Thyron, pale gray fur, narrow shoulders, the look of someone who had spent most of his life being underestimated. He found Nolan at the equipment station and said, in careful common tongue, "I know what this is." Nolan said, "Me too." Braddock had designed the pairing. Nobody in the academy missed what it meant. The two lowest-ranked cadets by intake metrics dropped into the same pair like a punchline. Several cadets glanced over when the list went up. Brull didn't bother hiding his expression. The trial was simple on paper. Enter a marked zone in the hunting preserve. Track a Vorathi stalker beast, a native apex predator, and land a tag on it before it tagged either of them. The beast hunted by scent, speed, and open ground pursuit. No cadet pair in the Academy's history had tagged it in under 20 minutes. Most lasted under 40 before the beast marked one of them and the trial ended. Standard kit: 2 tag rods, a terrain map, a compass pointing to magnetic north, which on Vorath was somewhere to the left of where instinct said north should be. They entered the zone at the far eastern edge, where the preserve opened into long, flat grassland. Every other pair broke immediately into tracking formation and worked the ground. Nolan stopped walking about 200 meters in and stood still. Fen stopped beside him. "What are you doing?" "Listening," Nolan said. He stood there for 10 minutes. Fen didn't ask again. He watched the grassland and after a while started listening too. Nolan was reading the wind, reading the sound profile of the zone, where birds called and where they didn't, where the grass moved in response to something heavier than air. He matched the topography off the map to what he could see, ridgelines to shadows to angles of light. He'd read the stalker beast's biometric profile twice on the transport out. The beast ran things down on flat ground. On flat ground, it was almost uncatchable. He pointed east-southeast. Ravine about 800 meters that way. Narrow at the base, maybe 4 meters wide. Terrain map shows it but doesn't call it deep. Fen said, "The beast doesn't chase in ravines." "Right," Nolan said, "it doesn't." They moved. 30 minutes to reach the ravine. Another 10 to find the entry point he wanted. The cut was narrow, rock-sided, with a short choke where both walls pressed in to about 2 meters across. He put Fen at the far end with a tag rod and positioned himself flat against the upper rock shelf, tucked into a shadow where the light came from the wrong angle for anything looking in from outside. Then he made noise. Not loud noise, the right kind. A low, irregular scrape spaced unevenly close to the distress sound profile listed in the beast's tracking behavior notes. 3 times. Silence. 4 minutes later, the stalker beast entered the ravine. Enormous up close. 3 meters at the shoulder, fast-twitch muscle under layered armored hide, forward-set eyes built for open-ground distance targeting. In the open, it was untouchable. In a 2-meter rock choke, it couldn't turn fast enough and the walls ate its stride entirely. Fen tagged it clean on the first strike. The beast reversed out in about 4 seconds and was gone. The tag registered on the confirmation screen. Fen stared at it. Then looked at Nolan with an expression that had no common tongue equivalent. They were the only pair to succeed. Every other team either failed to tag the beast or got tagged first. Average field time for the session, 31 minutes of active pursuit followed by failure. Nolan and Fenn had been out for 57 minutes. 50 of those were spent not chasing anything. That evening, Braddock sat alone in the review room and went through the footage. He watched the terrain selection sequence twice, watched the ravine positioning once more, then went back to the moment Nolan stopped in the open field and just listened. Braddock had trained cadets for 11 years. He'd seen fast cadets, strong cadets, cadets who could track a target across 3 kilometers of broken terrain on scent alone. He had never watched a cadet stop for 10 minutes doing nothing and be right about it. He closed the file, sat in the quiet for a while. In the barracks later, Sierra found Nolan at the water station and asked how he'd known where the ravine was without scouting it. He thought about it. "Back home, I grew up hunting in forests where the prey could kill you if you made noise," he said. "So you learned to read the terrain before you moved. You find where your advantage holds and bring the problem there." Sierra was quiet a moment. "What if you don't have an advantage?" "You make one," Nolan said. He filled his canteen and walked back to his bunk. Sierra stayed at the water station longer than she needed to. Word about the field trial moved through the academy the way bad news always does, fast, with extra detail added by whoever passed it along. By the second morning after the trial, Nolan had heard 3 different versions of his own story, each one slightly more embarrassing for Brull and slightly more unsettling for everyone else. He hadn't started any of them. Brull's response this time was not loud. That was worse. Gear started disappearing from Nolan's kit locker. First the secondary tag rod, then the spare boot liners, which mattered more than the rod because Voreth's ground temperature at night dropped low enough to cause real damage to unprotected feet. Then his sleep slot got swapped in the rotation schedule, and he was assigned the 2-hour window between the 3rd and 5th hours of night. The slot nobody wanted because it cut sleep into pieces too short to be useful. He got to the maintenance supply room before the clerk arrived. He knew the corridor outside it was empty at that hour because he'd tracked the foot traffic pattern there 3 days earlier out of habit. The clerk was a stocky Thyran, more confused than hostile. Nolan showed him the academy issue code on his intake form. The clerk shrugged and handed over replacement liners. The sleep rotation he didn't try to fix. He adjusted around it instead, sleeping in shorter bursts during off periods that were technically rest but not assigned rest. Less than optimal, and he knew it, but more than zero, which was what Brull was going for. Training was the harder problem. In the sparring yard, Nolan lost. Clearly often, and in ways that couldn't be hidden. Keth-born cadets hit him hard enough to put him on the ground. Thyran cadets moved past his guard before he registered the motion. The Academy's combat curriculum was built for species with reaction speeds, grip strength, and impact resistance that Nolan simply didn't have. Every session in the yard was a lesson in the distance between human physiology and everything else in the room. But he stopped losing the same way twice. That was deliberate. Each time a cadet put him down, he sat with it, not just from the pain, though the pain was real, but to watch what they'd done. Where the weight shifted before the strike. What the shoulder did in the fraction of a second before the arm moved. He couldn't match the speed, but speed is less useful when you already know where it's going. He also started learning Vorathi combat language, not from classes. He sat at the edge of the sparring yard during technique sessions and listened to Braddock correct cadets, working out what each instruction meant by watching what the cadet did before and after the correction. After 9 days, he had about 60 combat terms, enough to follow most of what Braddock said during live drills. Braddock noticed. He didn't say anything about it. 17 days in, Warden Tolas called Nolan to his office. It was near the top of the cliff complex, carved into solid rock, with one wide window looking out over the full span of the preserve. Tolas was older than anything else in the building. His scales faded to pale gray at the edges, his eyes still sharp. He sat behind a desk with nothing on it and watched Nolan stand in the doorway before gesturing him to a chair. He asked one question. "Why are you still here?" Nolan sat down and thought about it the way he did when a question deserved a real answer instead of a useful one. "Before I left," he said, "I was briefed by 3 conclave officials. 2 of them told me this placement was a diplomatic gesture. The third said directly that no human would finish the first month." He paused. "I was told humans weren't built for this. I wanted to see if that was true." Tolas looked at him, and, "Still finding out," Nolan said. Tolas dismissed him without comment. He waited until the footsteps faded down the corridor, opened his ledger, and wrote 4 lines in tight, careful script. He hadn't shown those notes to anyone. He'd been keeping them since the day the intake metrics printed, and they had changed character considerably since then. That evening Finn appeared at Nolan's bunk with a spare field ration pack, set it down without a word. Nolan looked at it, then at him. "Brull's group took yours from the locker," Finn said quietly. "I took 2 of theirs." "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Finn said, and went back to his own bunk. Nolan lay back and looked at the ceiling. The light above the door was on the way it always was. He'd stopped noticing it after the first week. He thought about Tola's and the one-question meeting, and what it said about a man who ran a place like this for 11 years and still asked things that direct. He thought about the shoulder tell on the Kethborn cadet in Lane 3. Then he thought about the deep preserve map in the briefing room, the one with the terrain for the midterm war game now 12 days out. He mapped the ravines from memory until the lights dimmed. The midterm war game. 4 days across the full hunting preserve, no walls, no instructor oversight once you were inside, no extraction until the clock ran out. Cadets split into hunter and prey units, roles swapping every 12 hours. Scoring was simple, tags given counted up, tags received counted against, best net score at the end ranked first for the term. Nolan went into the prey unit first. Nobody looked surprised. A few cadets in the hunter unit looked satisfied. Brull was among the hunters. He'd arranged it 2 days before the start, traded a shift assignment with another Keth-born cadet to get there. Nolan had watched the trade happen from across the briefing room and said nothing. The preserve entry point was a ridge at the western edge. At dawn on day 1, the prey units were released. 38 cadets broke for the terrain, most of them running hard for the dense cover in the northeast quadrant, which offered the best natural concealment for larger species. Nolan went southwest. Finn, without being asked, went with him. They walked. The hunters weren't released for another 2 hours, and running left deep tracks and broke ground vegetation in patterns that read clearly from any elevation. They moved along rock edges where footprints didn't register in the soft ground. Nolan had been studying the preserve map for 12 days. He'd identified 7 spots where terrain features could misdirect pursuit, 3 canyon systems with multiple entry and exit points, 2 high ridges with no cover but full visibility of the approaches below. He'd also spent the past 4 evenings pulling thin wire from a broken equipment rack in the maintenance bay, 2 meters at a time, until he had 14 meters coiled into his kit. Over the next 6 hours, he built 4 trip-trigger arrays across approach paths any reasonable hunter would use to enter the southwest section. None of them were dangerous, just noisemakers. A wire loop attached to a small rock pile that scattered when pulled, enough sound to tell him direction and distance of pursuit without needing line of sight. Then he built a false trail leading northeast toward where the other prey cadets had actually gone, spending 40 minutes making 2 sets of convincing prints near a water source and backing out carefully on the rock line. When the hunter units entered the preserve, 3 squads spent most of the first rotation on that trail. Brull's squad wasted 4 hours. When Brull figured out what had happened, he reportedly said something in Keth that the nearby cadets chose not to translate directly. The soft version was that he was unhappy. The rotation switched at noon on day 2. Prey became hunter. Nolan had been prey for 12 hours and hadn't been tagged once. He knew which routes the hunters preferred, where they circled back when a trail went cold, and how they signaled position to each other using the short burst system in their kit communicators. He'd been listening to those patterns all morning. Now he was hunting, and everything he'd learned from being chased was a tool pointed the other direction. He and Finn took 2 targets in the first hour. Both were cadets who'd relied on speed over concealment, who had used the same creek bed approach twice that morning and hadn't adjusted. Nolan tagged the first one from 8 meters out, stepping from a shadow between 2 boulders. That cadet had walked past that spot twice during the prey rotation. Nolan had been behind those boulders both times. The second tag took longer, a senior Thyran who moved well and changed direction without pattern. Nolan tracked him for 90 minutes without closing distance, watching the rhythm of the moves rather than the position. Everyone has a pattern. Under pressure, the pattern gets shorter and more predictable. On the 4th direction change, the Thyran went left. Nolan was already there. But the tag that mattered was Brawl. Brawl was better in the field than Nolan had expected. He didn't chase, he set ambushes, and he was good at it. 3 cadets had been tagged by Brawl before noon on day 3, all of them by walking into positions he'd pre-selected along their own escape routes. Nolan tracked Brawl for 6 hours before doing anything, watched from a distance and worked out the logic of how Brawl chose positions. Always elevated, always with a rear exit, always facing the most likely approach vector. So Nolan came from the rear exit. He got to the position before Brawl did, moved through it quietly while Brawl was still setting up on the front face of the rise, tagged him from behind at close range before Brawl knew anyone was in the same grid square. Brawl turned around, slowly. He looked at Nolan for a long moment. His expression worked through several things and finally settled on something that didn't have a name in Keth or in common tongue. The look of someone who had just correctly identified what kind of threat they were dealing with, about 3 weeks too late. Nobody said anything. Nolan walked back down the rise and went looking for the next target. That evening, the tag tallies went on the board at the staging post. Nolan's score wasn't the highest in the exercise, but it wasn't low by a wide margin either, and every cadet looking at that board who knew which names were next to which numbers was running a quiet calculation nobody said out loud. The academy had gone a different kind of quiet. After the war game results posted, the barracks changed in a way that was hard to point at directly. Nobody treated Nolan with warmth. That wasn't what happened. What happened was that cadets stopped treating him like background noise. They started glancing at him when he entered a room. Some moved in small ways to give him space without being asked. Brawl's group still held the same corner of the mess hall and still watched him when he walked in, but the watching had changed. It wasn't sizing up a target anymore. It was something more careful than that. Sierra challenged him formally on the 28th day. She found him in the equipment yard in the evening, most cadets at dinner, and laid out the terms without a preamble. Tracking duel in the canyon system on the preserve's south edge. 6 hours. Standard kit only, no wire, nothing beyond what the academy issued. Whoever tagged the other first one. If neither tagged the other within the time limit, it was a draw and no rank moved. Nolan looked at her. You don't have to do this to get information, you could just ask. Sierra said, this is how I ask. He accepted. They entered the canyon system from opposite ends an hour before dawn. The system ran roughly 3 kilometers north to south, a series of interconnected cuts in the rock, one central canyon that was wide and easy to move through, and a dozen smaller branches splitting off at irregular angles. Visibility varied. Sound bounced and split in the rock walls in ways that made direction hard to judge. Nolan knew this because he'd tested it 3 weeks earlier. He'd spent an afternoon in those canyons throwing rocks against different wall faces and tracking where the echo landed versus where it should have. He moved in from the north and immediately went into a side branch off the primary route. Found a position 7 meters up the rock face, a narrow ledge with solid footing and an eastern wall shadow that would hold until mid-morning. He sat down. He waited. He could hear Sierra. Not always clearly and not always heard directly, sometimes just the absence of what should have been there. A bird call cutting off, a shift in the wind as something moved through a gap in the rock. She was very good. She moved cleaner than almost anyone else in the academy, almost no sound at all. But the canyon system made sound in patterns, and anything moving through it changed those patterns. And Nolan had been listening to those patterns for 3 weeks, and the last 40 minutes specifically. He tracked her by what she wasn't doing to the air. She came close twice in the first 2 hours. Once she passed within 20 meters of his ledge and he watched her from the shadow without breathing very much. She was scanning the terrain ahead, not above and to the side. On flat ground, that's the right default. In a canyon with vertical structure, it isn't. She hadn't fully recalibrated for enclosed space. She moved past and continued south. What Nolan was doing was not hiding, he was hurting. Each time he read her trajectory, he shifted to a new position that closed one exit and left one open. Nothing she could detect, but consistently. Canyon systems with multiple branches have pinch points, places where the branches converge back to a single passage. He was pushing her toward the largest one, a narrowing near the south end where the walls closed to about 6 meters wide, and there was only one exit. She reached it near the 4-hour mark. He heard her stop, heard the specific quiet of something realizing the route ahead wasn't what it should be. She was good enough to sense the problem even without nomming it. She turned around. Nolan stepped out of the shadow behind her. She spun fast, 3 meters back, tag rod up in under a second, precise arc forward. Air. Nolan had taken one step right as she turned. The arc caught nothing. He tagged her on the return swing, rod touching her shoulder before she could pull back. Sierra stood still. Then she lowered the tag rod and looked at the canyon around her, the walls, the angles, the pinch behind her. She worked it out. He could see her doing it, tracing the route she'd taken over 6 hours, the branches that had seemed open and the ones that hadn't, the slow drift of her trajectory toward this one dead point. "You are moving me," she said. "Yes," Nolan said. "For how long?" "About 3 hours." She looked at him. Then she laughed. Not the kind of laugh that means something is funny. The kind you make when you've just understood something uncomfortable about the world and don't know what else to do with it. "How did you know I wouldn't detect you on the ledge at the second hour?" she asked. "My sensory range should have caught you." "You were scanning horizontal. I was above and left. The eastern wall shadow runs cold in the morning, cold background, cold surface, hard to pull a reading from." She thought about that. "You tested the thermal profile of that wall," she said, not a question. "3 weeks ago," he said. On the ridge above the south end of the canyon, Braddock had been watching through a long-range scope since the 3rd hour. He traced Sierra's route, and the way it had been, quietly and without a single visible push, redirected. He sat on the ridge after the duel ended and didn't move for a long while. He filed no report. He needed more time to think about what he'd watched. The final trial brief was 1 page. Solo entry into the deep preserve, 3 days, no partner, no extraction before the window closed. 7 hunter cadets assigned per target. Targets sent in at 30-minute intervals by intake score, lowest ranked first. Nolan went in last. He had 2 days between the duel with Sierra and the final trial start. He used both of them the same way he'd used most of his time at the academy. He studied. He pulled every terrain map of the deep preserve available in the briefing room and cross-referenced them against weather pattern data from the past 3 months. Noted which water sources held reliable and which dried out in the afternoon. Identified 4 route corridors with consistent structural cover and 2 that looked like cover but drained into open ground after about a kilometer. He also thought about the 7 hunters who'd be tracking him. He knew most of them from 6 weeks of observation, knew their defaults under pressure, who closed fast, who held wide and forced targets toward them, which 2 worked well together and which 3 were individually capable but tended to overlap their coverage zones when coordinated. He wrote none of this down. He didn't need to. He entered the preserve at sunrise on the 3rd day of the trial window. He didn't move toward any of the 4 logical deep cover corridors. He moved toward none of them. He took a route along the eastern perimeter, close to the preserve boundary, where terrain was open and cover was poor. Counterintuitive enough that the two hunter cadets who picked up his entry trail spent the first 4 hours waiting for him to turn inward. He didn't. He moved along the edge without any hurry, and then disappeared into a dry gully, where the boundary fence threw a consistent shadow, and used the gully floor to cross back toward the center of the preserve entirely underground, in soft terrain that held prints, but in a section nobody was watching. By the time the hunter group reformed and re-estimated his position, he was 6 kilometers into the deep preserve on a parallel line nobody had assigned a patrol. What followed over the next 26 hours was less a hunt and more a slow mechanical process. He moved when the light was flat and shadows were long. He stopped when he picked up the hunter's signal patterns on the kit communicator. He ate twice, slept 90 minutes in a shallow rock overhang near the preserve's northern edge, the farthest point from the extraction vector, and therefore the last place a hunter would look for a target moving toward extraction. He reached the extraction beacon at 31 minutes past the 29th hour. The fastest previous completion in the trial's history was 44 hours. The 7 hunter cadets came out of the preserve over the next 8 hours, ones and twos, tagged out or simply done. A senior Thyran with the best scouting record in the cohort came out without having seen Nolan once. A younger Keth-born cadet said he'd followed a trail for most of the second day that eventually curved in a wide arc back to his own starting position. He'd figured this out only when he found his own boot prints at an angle that made no sense. He was asked to explain it twice. He declined both times. The final assembly was in the main hall on the last morning. Graddock stood at the front with the results on a board behind him and read down the list. When he got to the bottom, he read Nolan's completion time the same way he read everything, flat, no comment. But the pause after the number ran about a second longer than any other pause in the whole recitation. Nobody said anything. Warden Tolas wasn't there. He was in his office. He'd already seen the results and had been sitting at his desk with the ledger open for a while. Then he wrote a message on a formal conclave document form, sealed it, and sent it by secure channel to the Galactic Conclave's Military Oversight Board. One sentence. The human species has been misclassified. In the barracks after the assembly, Nolan packed his bag. Didn't take long. He hadn't fully unpacked in 6 weeks. Fenn sat on the edge of the neighboring bunk and watched. "What are you going to do next?" Fenn asked. Nolan thought about it. "I don't know yet. Something longer term, probably." He folded his field jacket and set it on the bag. "Maybe come back here." "As a cadet." Nolan looked at him. "I don't know, maybe not." Fenn considered that for a moment, then nodded. The slow kind of nod that means someone just understood something that wasn't said. The transport was at the Ridge dock at noon. Nolan walked out of the barracks into the Voreth morning, heavy air, wrong-colored sky, gravity pressing into his shoulders the same as day one. He'd never stopped feeling it. His body had adapted, built up through 6 weeks of constant resistance just from existing in the environment, but the weight was always there. He didn't mind it anymore. Sierra was at the gate, leaning against the wall, not waiting for him specifically, just there. When he passed, she looked at him with those amber eyes that didn't miss much and said nothing. He nodded. She nodded back. Enough. He got on the transport and went asleep before it left the ground. Across the galaxy, a message arrived on a console at the Conclave Oversight Board that didn't see much unusual traffic. The duty officer read it twice, then forwarded it to his senior with one line added below it. Recommend immediate classification review. Nobody had expected that. Nobody had expected any of this.